Hello and welcome to the Cuyamonga Institute, our Q&A Conversation for Exploration series. I'm Paul Robert, the Executive Director and President of the Institute, and along with my wife, Laura Lee, the Director of Research, Education, and Outreach. And on behalf of our Board of Directors, advisors, volunteers, and supporting members, we want to thank you for joining us today. The Cuyamonga Institute is an independent, nonprofit research organization committed to researching consciousness and the human experience following the footsteps of our founder, anthropologist Dr. Felicitas Goodman. And as an educational institution, we take an open approach and we invite scholars in related fields to help us broaden the scope of our own work and exploration. That's why we call this Conversation for Exploration. On these weekly Sunday discussions, we've had a full spectrum of topics: neuroscience, anthropology, art history, archaeology, ecology, philosophy, mythology, shamanism, ritual, what?
On and on and on.
On
From the
and
arts
on,
to the sciences.
The arts to the sciences. So you're welcome to visit our website at cuyamongainstitute.com. All of our presentations are free. And as a nonprofit, of course, we invite you to become a supporting member. And we want to thank you, the community members who continue to support the mission of the Cuyamonga Institute.
We say it's a big universe out there. Let's go exploring.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And speaking of exploring, today, let's talk about the ancient practice of divination. Humans have always looked for answers to life's great mysteries. We ask ourselves, who are we? How did we get here? Do we control our destiny? What does the future hold? And how can we influence the future? There's a need to know. We're seeking spiritual understandings, and it's part of a universal human trait. And there's some form of divination has been used since the earliest times, and that's been reflected in ancient cultures around the world, including Egypt, Greece, the Maya, China, Mesopotamia, India, looking upwards to the heavens, stars, planets, constellations, eclipses, comets, to not only track time, but to understand the seasons, and in addition to see signs and to look for guidance. Others look to terrestrial patterns, looking at tossed sticks and bones and amulets and rocks. Other cultures look to the inner space, such as the Australian Aborigines with their dream time. And almost all could attain divination via some sort of shamanic trance state.
Well, I think it's hardwired in us to be in tune with our environment, or at least to desire to be in tune, and to read the signs. Oh, it's a survival mechanism. But more than that, I think it's just in our makeup to want to read the cues around us, to see the larger picture, to decipher the workings of the world, ourselves, nature, the universe, and to employ all the means at our disposal to do so. And part of that is to read the information and the guidance not readily seen or only seen with our inner senses. And we can get a little philosophical, asking, well, from what source might this added layer of information be? But as today's guest, Fred Smith, points out, he says, quote, "The seer sees forms, ideas, and entities flow into each other through the formless. They are strands of the same cloth that mesh with each other because they are part of a whole and formless fabric. More natural than supernatural," he says. Frederick Smith is a professor emeritus, professor of Sanskrit and classical Indian religions. He spent many years teaching and researching at the University of Iowa, lived for 16 years in India, still maintains a home in the Himalayas, now living in his hometown of Santa Fe, New Mexico. He's a good friend and advisor to the Cuyamonga Institute, and he's here to cover the history of divination in this part of the world that he has studied so deeply. He draws from his deep research into ancient Indian texts, including medical texts and texts on shamanic healing. He draws from his extensive fieldwork in India, witnessing various ceremonies and rituals and readings, methodologies. He'll share personal accounts and stories and observations. And, we were just last week talking about synchronicities and coincidence. Fred says divination is all about synchronicity and much, much more. Thanks for joining us, Fred.
Well, thank you, Paul and Laura, but I need to also thank you for just giving my lecture for me. So Are there any questions? Okay.
Ah,
So what I think we'll do here, let me just find my lecture in my oh, can you also make me a co-host?
Oh yeah, sure.
oh,
I
you've got
didn't
something to share.
absolutely can do
Okay, you're
that.
wearing a t-shirt that say, I advocate for science. So you will draw that connective tissue between science and divination for us along the way, I'm sure.
Well, I will try, but I know there are those who are better qualified than I in this Zoom room, and whose assistance I will happily seek. But I am a member of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and so they send me this T-shirt. Um,
He's got the T-shirt.
and, and where would you be in this world without like somebody sending you a T-shirt?
Right.
First, I have to ask, as I like to ask every guest, what is your quest? What is your personal mission in your work? Why India? What drew you there? And why look so deeply into divination? You have a personal story, I am sure, on this.
Well, I have several personal stories, I suppose, on this. Um, but let me just limit it to maybe one. Let me just reorganize my desktop here
Did you screen
so
share?
that I can.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I suppose that, if one looks back upon one's life, one can see that one is in a certain situation for all sorts of reasons. And I think that for most of us in this room, that will probably go back pretty far to a certain experience we might have had in youth or childhood or something like that, that was a premonition, perhaps, of
Personal experience. Okay.
personal experience of where we've ended up today. I know that this is the case with a lot of people, and if you, I know that when people ask me why have you studied India, why have you spent so many years there, 16, 18, 20 years in India, like I have, and I have different answers for that question depending upon who asks the question.
Mhm.
And if it's somebody who asks out of I'll say, well, I discovered at a relatively young age that I was good at exotic languages, so I ended up studying Sanskrit, which is exotic and notoriously difficult.
Mhm.
And or with others, I might say something else. I might say that as a result of a dream that I had that was a recurring dream that began at about the age of 4, in which certain place names and certain places in India were actually came into my dream states at that very age. And
Interesting.
then they kept coming, and then I ended up there as a teenager. So, there's that kind of thing too, which might be a premonition, even a divinatory premonition
When
of,
we're drawn to something and it feels right, I call that a form of divination. We're
yes.
sensing that we're a good fit, that we're called to it, that we're answering this call.
Mhm.
Describing. Hmm.
Right.
And the fact that I came from a family of scientists, doctors, and musicians and like that, that my view of my subjects have always been fairly scientific. I've never really dropped the scientific angle on what I study, but we have to understand that when we talk about ancient science, we're not talking about double-blind studies, but we're talking about certain kinds of empiricism.
Mm.
When I look at the ancient Indian, for example, medical texts, um, I see these as being empirical. I mean, there's a lot of empiricism that went in, and this empiricism is based upon their study of nature and what works and what doesn't work. And remember that in today's world, we're probably more separated from the natural world than humanity has ever been.
Yeah.
And all we need to do is go into any city, and we won't be able to see the sky at night. Um, I mean, I blame our separation from nature on Thomas Edison. He's the main guy I blame for turning night into day, and allowing us to escape into our evening televisions and everything else. And we don't know, we don't know what goes on around us. We can't hear the sound. Where was I? Recently, I was in Italy, and on a 7th floor apartment in the middle of downtown Milan. And, Milan is a really interesting place, but you can't hear the birds.
Mm-hmm.
You can barely see the birds. And you can barely see the stars. Maybe there's a hugely windy day, you can see the mountains off in a distance towards the Alps, because Milan isn't far away from that. But we've really selected this lifestyle in which we have placed ourselves at a distance from the natural world.
Yeah.
But that said, that my own experience of what's led me to where I am in life has been through recollection of the natural world, which has put me back in Santa Fe, the place where I was born, and knowing that I had to come back here. I mean, it's like I came back this year after 40 years of knowing I had to come back.
A salmon returning to its native
Yeah,
river.
and I
Yeah.
was lucky to be able to do that. And then having spent all those years in India, places in the Himalayas and so on, where you can see the stars, where there are a real, exuberance of birds,
Right.
and where people do lead their lives in direct contact with nature. Let me just give you an example of that stands a little bit outside of my talk, but I was walking around in the fields up in the Himalayas one day, and one thing about me is I hate shoes. I only wear them when absolutely necessary. And sometimes it should be necessary when I don't wear them. So I brushed my foot up against a stinging nettle, and stinging nettles grow wild everywhere there, and I'm very aware of them. And immediately I was stung. And I thought, oh shit, what am I going to do now? It's more stinging nettles, knowing that they could hurt for months.
Oh,
And,
okay.
but there was my milkman up in the Himalayas, said, what am I worried about? And he explained to me that wherever there is a poisonous plant, the
There's a
antidote is
healing
right next to it.
Yeah.
But you got to know what it is.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So I said, well, what is it? And he looked around. We looked around for a couple of minutes, and he found it. And he said to take these leaves from this plant and just rub it in the palms until you get like a kind of a resiny, pulpy thing, and then just place it right on the foot where I rubbed it against the stinging nettles. Now, I didn't know this before, and you're not going to find this in any medical text.
Right.
But the cure is right there, if we only know how to look for it.
If nature's left to its devices.
Yes,
Well,
nature
and what makes your
provides.
yeah, and what makes your story so interesting, Fred, is that razor's edge of a devotional practice, a scientific practice, and also being able to recognize the ancient wisdom from the past and looking at the wisdom of today, and connecting all those worlds together.
Yeah,
Why divorce
yeah,
any one of them, right? The more the merrier in terms of
yeah.
information. Yeah.
Well, let me just begin my talk here, which is
Sure.
I've entitled Magic Spells, Rituals, and Divination. Finally, what can we perform on Halloween? Because that's coming right up. And so let me just read a couple of paragraphs before I get into my own material here. So what I say here is that divination is the ability to read specifics of our world from observations apparently disconnected from the primary goal in front of us. That's my own definition. I checked Wikipedia and other sources this week in preparation for this talk. All of the definitions and descriptions hinge on words such as supernatural, occultism, superstition, and so on, and take great pains to separate it from science. You're even anti-science if you believe or practice divination. You're acting outside of the orbit of science. At the very least, Science or divination is disproven by science. It's an exercise in randomization. So arguments against the validity of divination go back to Cicero in the 1st century BCE, with a more or less constant stream opposing its possibility throughout the currents of rationalization in the West. But I have to say that this is not the case in Asia. Divination is not disparaged in Asian traditions, even if most of the high-profile literati and philosophers in China and India, for example, did not address it straight on. I would say they did more in China than in India. Nevertheless, you find huge texts on divination in India going all the way back to the Atharva Veda of about the 10th century BCE. A lot of ornithomancy, a word that Laura reminded me of this morning, but I had it on my agenda here in any case, which is divination through birds, knowing about birds. So so knowledge of divination is everywhere in the world. I mean, there's no culture, I'm going to wager, if you can find one culture that does not have some form of divination, then I would be surprised. There may be one someplace, but I don't know that one. But there's but there are arguments justified, especially in the present, the way we look at in the present context of the expansion of our knowledge of subtle realms of matter, synchronicity, and so on. And I think that some of us here, Tony and others, may weigh in on the whole notion of synchronicity as far as talking or thinking about divination.
Sure.
Well, let's first look at what we might regard as divination, dividing it into categories. And there could be a lot more categories than I just sort of came up with in a few minutes. One would be the connection of the physical or sensual world with numbers, which are abstract entities of arguable reality. I mean, is a number something real? When we talk about, well, we'll get into that. So a second category would be the ability to read nature as certain other animals can. And the older I get and the more I am in tune with animals, the more I can see that we got nothing on them. You talk about our like huge intelligence. It's led me into the whole field of deep ecology, which pretty much considers animals and other beings absolutely on a par with us ecologically.
Nature. And also that they're picking up signals that maybe we can't see, but those signals are there.
Those signals are there. We know, for example, about certain animals and birds that we're able to know beforehand about the tsunami in Indonesia in December 2003 that spread across the Indian Ocean, the Bay of Bengal, and left maybe 1 million people dead. But the animals on the east side of it, where it began, around the island of Sumatra, the animals were fleeing like hours in advance, and nobody knew why. And certainly humans were not aware of that. They were not able to predict this, but animals were, and birds were. So there are contexts in which the ability to read the omen's importance of those animals. For example, if we were able to understand that a flock of birds at 10 in the morning, suddenly flying east from a mountain in Thailand or Malaysia, was out of sync of what it normally does. If we were able to understand that, then there could have been advance warning, that kind of thing.
Right.
There's a wonderful book called When the Snake's Awake about animals detecting earthquakes before they happen.
Yes.
For example.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, that if we could read that kind of thing, this would constitute a category of divination.
Mm-hmm.
But is it supernatural? Is it superstitious? No, it's simply, and it's very natural. It's us expanding out our our own antennae,
Yeah.
which is not supernatural. It's natural, but we need to develop these skills, and these skills can be developed. But
Right.
we,
Okay, then you're
but
implying
our
that
whole,
just as the animals have sensory apparatus to detect the frequencies going through the earth, for example, during an earthquake, why aren't we equipped with that? Or maybe we are, but it's just dormant, right? And or maybe some people have it to an extra degree, these sensory apparatus. So right there's some mechanism, physiologically, you're suggesting, in that case,
yeah,
that can be
yeah.
activated. Okay.
Um, Other categories that I was thinking here is there's historically there are lists in all kinds of literature of um, of omen's importance, um, and oral traditions besides being in published lists and categories.
Right.
So there's a lot that's there, and and we can read that, think about it, how valid is it? How idiosyncratic might it be that something completely idiosyncratic would find its way into a text? It's easy for that to happen. Um, and but in any case, if we attune ourselves to nature in this way, we can pick up these signals, not just in a tsunami or earthquake, but otherwise as well. Um, and the ability to place ourselves, another category here, the ability to place ourselves in an unencumbered moment, in an arena of selfhood that brings up for us, as if on a screen, connections between things both deep and less subtle levels, both specific and symbolic. Now, how do we do that? There's all kinds of practices, religious or spiritual practices, or even scientific practices. I mean, things like vipassana are fitting themselves right into scientific paradigms now of quieting the mind, bringing ourselves to a state of calmness, placing ourselves in the moment
Mm-hmm.
when we're outside, um, and being able to detect things because we're in a state of quietude. Now, one of the things, also, I wanted to mention one thing that I did about 30 years ago. I was in England for a while, and I studied some exotic forms of qigong
Yeah.
Oh.
with a Chinese for about 3 years, with this Chinese kind of wizard
Yeah.
who had moved to London. And one of the things that he taught us was about um, how to understand trees and what can they teach us.
Ah.
So there was a group of us that went out somewhere near Oxford, um, and for a week at a retreat center, totally in seclusion. And what we learned was, with qigong and these things, was energies, feeling energies.
Mm-hmm.
So he would take us to different trees and say, this is an elm tree, this is a birch tree, this is an oak tree, this is something else like that. And I don't want you to touch the tree, but I want you to empty your mind and put your hands near the tree, a few inches, half foot from it, and feel the energy of the tree. And then we would do this like all day for like 6 days. And he would run us through these other kinds of exercises, like stand in the center of a field
Mhm.
and slowly breathe and feel the energy of that direction and turn to quarter direction, full direction, so that you're doing 8 turns around,
Yeah.
northeast, like that, and take a couple of breaths. And then after you go all the way around, which could take a few minutes because you're not supposed to rush this.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and decide, understand for yourself what direction is the chi or the prana
Right.
flowing most smoothly.
Mm-hmm.
And um, do this, the guy said, if you go in for an interview, for example, and if you go in for an interview and you want it to work well, you'll just kind of quickly sense the directions, face the interviewer from the direction that seems where the chi or prana seems to flow most smoothly.
Interesting.
Beautifully said.
And that might be a more successful interview. That's a form of divination.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
The final exam of our tree course was a two-part exam. One was, well, they were both blindfolded. So we would be blindfolded, each one of us, there must have been about 20 of us. And then he would spin us around one direction and the other until we were almost dizzy.
Yeah.
And then he would lead us to a tree and say, put your hands up and identify that tree. And that was one part of the exam. And we all were able to get it because we were all able to, by that time, understand what one tree was and the other tree. And the second part of the exam was to lead us to a tree, blindfolded again, and ask us, what value can that tree have for you? What is the divinatory usefulness of this kind of tree? Yeah, people said different kinds of things too. So it was interesting to get kind of a catalog of that just from our own group. I mean, I can't say who's right or who's wrong, but it was interesting to see like very, very strong consistencies on trees that had weak energies like an elm, or trees that had really strong energies like an oak or these enormous birch trees that they have in England. So, you know, it was interesting just to know what these trees could be of value to us in our lives. I mean, what kind of trees do we want to plant in our front yard? What can be good for us? Well, you know, what can work for us? And so anyway, I just wanted to mention that as an experience of divination.
Yeah.
What is the
So it can be
energy?
cultivated. Divinatory skill
Can
can be cultivated,
Right.
which is one of the points I kind of wanted to make here. And it can be learned, it can be cultivated. People can, and like, let me just get back to my talk here for a second.
I do want to agree with you though that idea of being able to be cultivated, because there's this sometimes misperception that it's a practice for shamans or someone outside of ourselves, but that it's a practice within ourselves that could be developed, and all of us have that ability to cultivate and fine tune that practice.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. So we should ask ourselves, what is divination supposed to do?
Right.
I mean, divination has the very sense of we're divining something which has yet to occur. So the first answer is then that it's used to foretell the future, but it's just as important. It's a guide. It's to guide us through our present actions, dilemmas, and circumstances. Perhaps most common forms of divination that we're familiar with. And, you know, maybe this is, if you can think of others, then pipe in. But for me, the most common forms of divination that I've seen are easy ones like dice,
Yeah.
gambling, but particularly, I mean, gambling can be complicated, but, you know, card games, but dice. Then we have on slightly more complicated levels, we have astrology, tarot, I Ching, and other forms of apparent randomization with extensive histories of actively encapsulating current life situations. But there's a lot more than that. anyone who cultivates any form of divination understands that what they've cultivated is the ability to make connections. What they've developed is insight into layers, strata, or segments of the visible and invisible world to solve problems, most of them eminently practical problems. Western science has developed a tremendous ability to segment the universe, to divide it into ever more refined particles. This is an almost opposite procedure from what they've developed in Asian philosophy, which is instead of to take things apart, to put things together. It's a different kind of logic when we start putting things together, but it's just as complicated and promising as taking things apart.
Yeah.
And divination is really the art of putting disparate things together. We're very good at coming up with new microparticles. You know, we read in the newspaper, science section of the New York Times, new particle discovered, and but it's up to us to use a different kind of thought paradigm to put them together. And among the different kinds of divination that I have seen and observed and even participated in my research has been oracular possession.
Oh.
And this is a very, very big and complicated and deep subject. And of which there's been text. I found a bunch of manuscripts in a collection, 2 collections in India that had never been looked at before, Sanskrit manuscripts on oracular possession. So I managed to translate them and discovered that the practices within these texts were still current in some places. Not only were they current, but they were pretty much identical with practices in China. And these, so I tried to trace it back historically and discovered that the Indian text really predated the Chinese text, but they both go back like 1,000 years, at least. So among the case studies I've seen are a lot of it is oracular possession, in which the boundaries between
oracular possession. I mean, how do you mean that? What are we talking about? I know you've touched on that in previous talks.
I have, yeah. And I'll get into that.
And where did you find these texts? In somebody's drawer or some temple? I mean, where were they? That nobody's seen them.
Well, they're actually, these 2 collections were in manuscript libraries that anyone can access, because people give their collections off to these libraries when there's nobody left in the family who can read them or understand them. And I mean, it was weird because one of these collections of manuscripts was about induced childhood possession of certain deities, particularly Hanuman, the monkey god.
Induced, intentional, okay.
Intentional. Why don't I just describe that? And some of the weird repercussions of me having discovered this. And I discovered these manuscripts in both Mysore and in Chennai, in the southern part of India, both in very big manuscript libraries. It took me forever to get the manuscripts because of the dilatory nature of asking a librarian to give you a manuscript in India. Sometimes it could take years, sometimes it could take weeks. But eventually I was able to get what I wanted. And the procedure was that a child, or the idea, and this goes back way into antiquity, into China also. And I found a lot of stuff from China about this too. Chinese divinatory practices. of taking a child, a prepubescent child, male or female, didn't much matter, but one who was quiet and innocent, and reciting certain mantras that were for certain deities, inviting the possession of that deity into the child, the and then kind of there for maybe a few minutes or half an hour or an hour, whatever it was, and people would come for oracular sessions. They would come and ask questions.
A Q&A with that supposed
What's that?
deity through the mouthpiece of this child.
Through the mouth of the child. The idea was that adults would just ruin the whole process. There was through their own anyway, that they couldn't quite get it right. So the children they could trust. But then people would ask questions and they would get certain answers. They could be about anything, like about, why their cows were dying suddenly, or somebody was asking what happened to their son who'd gone off to Bombay a year ago and they hadn't heard from him. That kind of thing. How's he doing? This sort of question. And then there were answers that were forthcoming. And then there was a procedure for removing this particular spirit or deity or force or whatever it is from the child.
Return to normal.
Return to normal. There's a lot you can say about the ethics of this, or we can talk about that endlessly. I'm just telling you what the procedures were in these manuscripts, and that surprising thing was that it's still practiced today. But among the delicacy of this, as far as the ethics are concerned, I was working on this part of my project with this one guy from that area of state of Andhra Pradesh in South India. And these manuscripts were in Telugu script. They were in Sanskrit, but in Telugu, that's in the script of the language they're called Telugu. And so this guy said, he said he would take me out to a village where they actually do this. And I thought, oh, they still do it? So that's where I saw what I did. But then, and we asked them if they had more manuscripts that described processes like this.
Yeah.
And they said, yes, they did. They said, so we said, okay, well, we made an appointment to come back like a month or two later to look at the manuscripts. And in that intervening time, apparently they had conversations with some of the other people within their circles, and they burned all those manuscripts.
They burned them?
They destroyed them. They didn't want them getting into our hands.
Wow.
So, this is
serious stuff.
This is scary stuff. They thought that these were really powerful, delicate practices, and they knew how to use them, and we didn't. And
Right.
they might be right.
And they might be right.
Might be right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you're touching on the power of possession trance. And that's another deeper topic, which is probably off topic in some ways, but it's something that which was also the origins of the research that Dr. Goodman did, trying to understand that those trance states and what can be brought about. And these elements that you've researched and studied is just so overwhelmingly shocking and powerful.
Well, Erica Borgignon
Right.
studied that.
Right.
Felicitas went off on her own
Right.
track with
They
non-possession
work together. Right.
trances.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
Sobering. Yeah.
one thing that I wanted to do was also really try to break through the barrier that's been set up for us in the last couple of hundred years by words like religion. Religion is a pretty new word. It used to be just culture. Now they've divided religion and culture. And what we're talking about is divination. It was simply part of what life was like. But since there's been a sequestering of, for example, divination from culture and including it within the whole realm of religion, placing divination within the realm of religion, that immediately removes it from the realm of serious investigation.
Got it.
Okay.
And we cannot do that. It's not treating the subject properly on that. But I wanted to talk about a few different forms of divination. One thing I wanted to do here today was actually do a little bit of divination. Are any of you interested in doing a little bit of divination?
I'm sure.
You can put that in the chat room,
I'm
and
sure.
we can go through the chat.
And anybody, if anybody doesn't want to do some divination, put that in the chat room. Do I see a couple of
Well,
bringing the unconscious into consciousness and processing it?
That's a good definition.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
well, yeah, there was a couple of
amen. Okay, yes, please. A bunch of comments. Okay. Do we have a quorum on this? Okay.
and a couple questions just since you've stopped to address the chat room. Anne wanted to know the difference between divination and intuition, then also asked about divination and healing.
Okay, I've thought about that. Yeah, right. Divination does just like divination is something that can be cultivated and learned. Intuition is also something that can be cultivated.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, some people have a greater gift for it naturally than others, but that's only because there may be certain filters between their conscious and subconscious worlds that are maybe more permeable. And this whole notion of permeability. Oh, Linda's here from Philadelphia. Great. Kinesiological muscle testing is a form of divination. Great. And yes, intuition is always there, but there may be blockages that are put up even by us conceptually so that we don't go there.
Okay, stop on that point. Yes, our society does that, right? When you have those deep hunches and then you're talked out of them or you dismiss them, right? That's society's voice saying, oh, don't pay attention. That's a gift to have those deep hunches, to be in the knowing, to spontaneously just know. You don't have to question it, just go with it. You know that particular feeling. So yeah, there's a lot of barriers to this.
Yeah, there are barriers, and some of us are, for whatever birth reasons or in the deep and hoary past, our filtration systems are lighter and we are become more permeable. So that's the thing, is that if we become too permeable, then we kind of lose track of what world we're in. I mean, some of these people I hung out with in the Himalayas, I mean, who were in these kind of oracular states, like, for a lot of their lives. I mean, there was this one guy who kind of took me under his wing up in his village about 3 or 4 very difficult kilometers from my house. And, you kind of had to walk through, took about an hour to get, sort of difficult trek to get to this little village.
Yeah.
And, but he kind of took me under his wing. And I gradually understand, many people considered him to be insane, but he wasn't insane at all. It's just that his filter between these subconscious, unconscious, rational, intuitive realms was so fluid that only if you really, and I used to stay at his house when I was up there, so only then did you know that he was always talking sense. But to many people, it sounded like nonsense. But it was okay. But in the end, everybody in his village, he was a senior person in the village, everybody listened to him. When he talked, everybody stopped and listened to him because they understood, they knew that he had access to these deep levels of of divinatory consciousness.
This brings up a question before we do any divination experiment. But okay, so Goodman, Dr. Goodman, founder of this institute, understood these states as a physiological shift that's quite normal and natural. Maybe not common, but normal and natural. And that through ritual you can activate these states. Your body goes, oh, I know that. I know the cues of that, and I'll move into this state. And so you can look at different wiring of the brain, different functioning of the brain. It can be tested in the laboratory. You're now in a fuller spectrum of brain waves, and your biochemistry is now shifted to support these states. So if you're using a ritual to call in a deity, because that is your language, that this state involves a deity, that could just be a mythical overlay culturally to that state, could it not?
That's an interesting
And so that there's a understanding, maybe a DNA or ancestral or whatever you want to call it, memory, I don't know, different explanations for this, but you're really just shifting into a state for a certain amount of time. You're maybe more open to the supernature of other animals detecting information in their environment. So here we're activating and giving our bodies permission to now pick up cues. Maybe with a child, they're more innocent, they're not processing it through the intellect as much, right? So that's why I don't know, I'm just wondering, you mentioned it's more natural than supernatural. Maybe there's more to us than our society allows. These things would not endure if they didn't work. There would not be so much widespread
and cultures
divination methodologies, cultivation of these talents, attention paid, sacred text written and burned if in danger of being shared, than if it didn't work, right? So I just think that we're more than we know. And maybe it's not as spooky as, there's a lot of taboos placed on this. Use with caution, understood.
Or more than science
Don't
allows,
abuse.
Misha says, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. One example of one thing that I was in a village in India, and there was a person whom I wanted to see who was kind of on his deathbed. And I went to the doctor and he said, let's go over to their house. And on the way over there, he saw a crow on the left side of the road on a lower branch cawing. And he said, the guy's not going to make it. And I said, how do you know that? And he said, because of the position of that crow over there.
Oh, yeah.
What? And when we got there, the person he didn't live more than a few more minutes. And so again, this is a form of divination.
Yeah.
And I said, how did you know that? And he said, because it's in a lot of old medical texts. And he learned it through his study of Ayurveda, of an esoteric branch of Ayurveda. And I later found that in a text of about 2,000 years old, Charaka Samhita. And so these things are recorded. But how much of this actually enters into practice that people follow because of the medicalization of medicine, we lose what actually was, forms of medicine in those days. And that also enters into the subconscious of what we practice. So the subconscious aspects of this guy who lived out in nature in a village, away from the big city, and was able to follow the movements of the birds and so on, was able to detect this. I found something here on ornithomancy that I would like to just share while we're at it. Now, ornithology, has to do with birds. Mancy has to do with magic and detection. Feng Shui practitioner, the movements of birds, right. And ornithomancy goes back in the Western tradition well, as it does in India, it goes back to the Atharva Veda of the 10th century BC, but also in the Western tradition, it goes back to Hesiod and Homer. And the Odyssey, where an eagle appeared 3 times, flying to the right, and was holding a dead dove in its talons in the Odyssey. And what was it? An augury of the coming of Odysseus and the death of his wife's suitors. So we have an example of it there. So there's favorable forms of ornithomancy, and those that are sinister. So and
Birds as messengers, right? They're neutral. They're just bringing the message.
Right.
they could be messengers, like knowing, like this doctor knowing that this person was going to die. This was spontaneous, or it could be the result of a formal consultation, and there the diviner would face the different directions, kind of like what we did in our tree court final exam.
Right.
Would face north, but in this case, you would look for birds that are on your north side, west side, right side, left side, like that, and understanding what would be a favorable direction. The different kinds of birds would have different
Meanings?
different meanings. Like blackbirds were considered to be a good omen. Bluebirds indicated happiness or spiritual awakening. Cardinals would indicate life-altering events, or taking extra care of your health was necessary. A crane would indicate the need for wisdom in the near future. Crows were usually considered a bad omen, and their cawing would mean that your enemies are actively working against you. But if a crow would caw 3 times only, that would be a good omen. And doves were indicative of good fortune, and ducks of stable relationship. And a quacking of a duck was good luck. And eagles would usually foretell bad luck, but could also represent powers and strengths. And so on. I've got like about
Cranes,
25 different birds here.
babies coming, or storks.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
as a professor, you were tenured, Professor Emeritus. You're a professor of religion, right? And culture.
Well, I was professor of Sanskrit and classical Indian religion. Yes, that was my title.
Religion is right in there. How did you navigate? And you're wearing a T-shirt. I advocate science. How did you navigate this rather slippery slope here between, I want to see some evidence. I want to see. I appreciate these cultures, and I trust that there's something here that needs to be investigated, and I'm drawn to this. How did you navigate that? How do you still? Because it requires a different worldview. Science is going to look at, I want to see direct cause and effect, and you're more open, and there's a different worldview here that you're entering into to say there's more to this world than our society allows or leads or believes. There's more.
That's true, but that doesn't deny the whole cause and effects relationship.
Yeah.
And I think that as we venture into greater and subtler realms of scientific consideration, for example, energy, I think that probably in a few generations, most of the healing in the medical world is going to be energy healing.
I agree with that. Yeah.
That's one thing that I believe will be forthcoming. And again, it's going to be a big revolution, both in understanding it and in activating it, because we have, I mean, just because of the difficulties in getting electric cars going, which could have happened 20 years ago. But you have, business and industry and insurance companies and everybody else working to preserve the status quo. But I do think that there's enough scientific progress being made so that it'll take a few generations, but I do think that energy healing will be way more prominent in a few generations, and the practices will be more practiced, and the ways of learning it will be much more streamlined. Instead of just like a few people out there who have a little intuition about them doing this, that these things can be integrated more into medical training.
And the more that the old ways stop working, the more room there is for these really ancient ways to come back. But go ahead.
Yeah, I just saw in the chat room there the word owls. Somebody wrote the word owls. Oh, Tony. Owls, question mark? Which reminded me of another forms of divination that I've seen in India. One of my really closest friends there for decades is somebody who's actually an alchemist and who practices alchemy in the old, both European and Indian. He's studied for years in esoteric traditions in both France and in a certain corner of India, and has a practice that's unbelievably successful practice.
Define success. How? What's he doing?
He has managed to produce alchemical gold it's not real gold, mind you, it's alchemical gold, which is a different thing. And he's placed it within certain, he managed to fix it in certain ways. He has this like 4-story laboratory outside of Pune. And he sells this concoction to European drug companies that they added to, it's an additive to certain chemotherapy medicines in Europe, and he's made millions on this, maybe millions, producing something according to the old alchemical system. He's absolutely rigorous in his science. He writes down every step of every process he's done for 40 years.
I see.
And has really, really perfected his chemistry of this and his understanding of the way and a lot of it is divination. So, okay, where this owls comes in.
Yeah.
People have heard about his work. And somebody wrote to him from Los Angeles. I usually stay at his house when I'm in Pune, where I used to live. And somebody wrote to him and said, I will pay you $100,000 if you can send me the heart and liver of an owl to use as black magic.
Oh.
See, he gets requests like that.
I see.
And because these are kind of very negative divinatory objects. Of course, he wouldn't do it. I mean, he would never do that. But people think that because of his knowledge of these esoteric practices, that he would actually find an owl dissected and send some guy in Los Angeles the heart and liver of an owl. I mean, this is insane. He would never do anything like that. But people are interested in these kinds of things. Whether there is any, veracity to such kinds of divination, I don't know.
Well, is he actually changing the atomic makeup of an element? Is he able to transform an element? Isn't that the definition of alchemy? Or what is his?
Exactly.
Okay, so Louis Kervan, talking about France, we had an interview on this, was looking at room temperature alchemical transformations, I guess you would call it, in nature, where, for example, chickens produce a lot of calcium to make an egg, but they're not eating as much calcium as they produce. So his theory was that, speaking of birds, that chickens are able to transform the elements of their diet into the elements they need to produce the egg that they do. One example among many. So he was looking at actually nature doing this. And of course, this is deemed impossible, right, by our science.
Yeah,
So interesting. And has he cracked the code for what the medieval alchemists were defining as, quote, gold? You're saying it's not the same substance as
no,
physical gold, but it's
no,
something.
it's
And
something.
so,
Yeah, where the molecular structure has been transformed due to this
yeah.
I've observed this guy's processes at in detail and at great length, and it takes him 6 months to watch something be transformed. It has to go through all the colors of the rainbow, and he's managed to get mercury. So mercury is used as a catalyzer for certain other substances which he has in his lab, and it's kind of a miraculous thing to watch.
You've been
Oh,
in
here
some
we go,
interesting
Linda.
places.
Oh, sorry to see you go. All right, um,
Okay.
and uh, okay, so
You're funny. Uh,
all right. So
You know, you
anyway,
can't help. You can't help but have your worldview shifted, Fred. The
you can't
places
help.
you've
No,
gone and
my
what you've witnessed. Oh
I
my
think, but
gosh.
Laura was asking originally there, and I want to come back to that for a second. Is that
Yeah.
what from teenager, from going to college? Usually, when people talk of India, there was some kind of devotional practice that brought them to research India, something that brought them across that threshold, and then they find out this world of ancient science and all the technologies and all the different elements. We think of India in terms of yoga and meditation and these different practices, but
That's your question, not mine.
I know. Well,
Yeah.
but this became a lifetime journey for you from college age until now, where you're just continually dissecting and going deeper and deeper and deeper into a world where maybe even most Indians don't understand. People from the
oh, they
country don't
don't.
have this kind of depth.
No, no. I'm probably one of the few people who's bothered to really focus on what this friend of mine in Pune, this alchemist guy, does. So, and I understand it's miraculous, but it's a miracle of nature.
Thank you. Miracles of nature.
It's
Yeah.
Yeah.
a miracle of nature. It's not like, some sort of God out there, putting down a hand and bestowing us an instant transformation. But miracles are miracles of nature.
Yeah.
And they're defined as miracles from our Western perspective because we're this narrow when maybe we want to expand it out, and then it would be nature, normal,
Yeah.
right? It's
I
it's the
mean,
fault of our perspective that's so limiting.
yeah, I want to talk about one form of divination. But I want to bring up, wait, where's, um, as part of my research about 20 years ago, into oracular possession, I was traveling around South India, and I'd heard that there was a Tibetan woman who lived in one of these really big Tibetan colonies. There's two of them in South India. Um, One was in a place called Bailakupe, where I went because I wanted to look for this woman who was apparently really an amazing expert at mirror divination.
Ah,
And I went to the colony and I found this guy who knew English and a guy from Los Angeles, a Tibetan who was born way in India, but near the Tibetan border. And he'd learned English and he'd gone to Los Angeles and he told me about his life where he would become an alcoholic and his wife left him and he felt completely separated from his indigenous Tibetan culture and just was making a mess out of things. So he decided to come back and live in a Tibetan colony in India so he could recapture his own spirituality, his own roots, his own direction, his own persona, his self. So he came back. I met him really pretty quickly. It was amazing. And I said, okay, I'm looking for this person called Amate Bap. And he said he'd never heard of her. And I said, well, supposedly she's in this colony, which is 35,000 acres in size.
Uh-huh.
wow.
And I said, okay, let's go. So he managed he had a car. Actually, I had a car. I had a taxi that I picked up in Mysore and drove out there about 80 kilometers. And I said, well, let's look for her. We looked and looked and looked for hours and hours, for 2 days. Finally, we found her. And he was beginning to get sort of a little bit pissed at me for wasting his time. But we finally found her at the edge of this colony in this little house that was in none too good shape. And so we knocked on the door. We found her there, and she was regularly consulted by people in the Tibetan community there. And I wanted to ask her about her form of mirror divination. What she's facing is a mirror.
Okay.
And with this katai, white Tibetan offering cloths on, over it. And she was a little bit ragged in appearance. And she asked me why I was there. And I said, well, two reasons. One, I'm always interested in meeting beautiful women. And second was I was interested in mirror divination. So she spruced herself up a little bit. And she was really happy to hear both of those, actually, I have to tell you. And so she sat down in front of her altar, and the Tibetan guy and I were sort of opposite her. She was looking at us. And I made the quick decision. I'm not going to ask her about her mirror divination. That's not the way to find out about it.
Right.
The way for me to find out about somebody who's spent her whole life, in this state, was to just ask her for a session.
Yeah.
And now mirror divination can be done not just with a mirror, but you can even read back in Alexander the Great's time, where there were mirrors, there were ships with mirrors on them that were used for divining which direction to go in. And people would put oil on their thumb and stare into their thumb. So this kind of reflective divination was a very, very major form in antiquity and continues to the present day in India, in Tibet, among the Tibetan expat community, and undoubtedly elsewhere in the world, because you can see other forms in the mirror. In this case, there was a certain deity that was in the mirror that she was able to conjure up. And she was taught. Again, this is something that's taught. It doesn't just come onto her by some natural thing, but there's lineages of practice of these things. And so she said she wanted to do a divination on me. I said, no, I wanted her to do a divination on this troubled Tibetan guy. And he said he didn't want to do one because he was too embarrassed about his life. But I talked him into it. I said, no, you're here for a reason. You came back home for a reason. And you got to see what she wants to tell you.
Yeah.
So he did a divination session on her. And rather, she did a divination session on him.
Right.
And he talked a bit about his life. He translated for me from Tibetan what he was telling her. And then he translated back what she was telling. And then she looked into her mirror. She would throw rice up in the air, up and down in the air. And then she said a few things that were incomprehensible. And she was obviously not, her eyes were sort of glazed, and she was taking in everything he was saying. And then she kind of came out of her trance state and reported to him what she had seen, and which had to do with certain aspects of his personal life, his methods that he needed to do for rectification of that, certain Tibetan ritual practices that he had to immediately perform within the next few days, which could be done with some of these magnificent Tibetan temples that they've reconstructed in Bailakupe. And so that was the divination. And then she said, wait a minute, I wasn't going to get away so easy. And so
So you
I
sat
wasn't
with
gonna
her.
bob it off on him, you know.
Yeah.
So she asked me about myself, and he translated, of course. Um, and I was in a certain situation at that time that was, um, let's say I was kind of on the edge.
Okay.
I was on the edge of a marriage that was about to like finish its lifetime, finish its natural lifespan, let's say. And even though I was getting on with that with my wife at that time, um, it was something that was of pressing concern to me.
Right.
And so I mentioned that to her, and she looked into her mirror and went into her trance state, was throwing rice around the room and over herself, and taking sips of water and doing various ritual actions around her altar, meanwhile staring into this altar. And I really wish that I could have gone around and tried to see what was in her mirror. Of course, I couldn't do that, nor would I have been able to see it even if I did.
Right.
And then she reported back that I needed to do certain things, recite certain mantras, that the situation was not promising, and that it would not work out as well as I wanted it to, but I could mitigate the ill effects of it by certain mantras and certain performances from some of the Tibetan priesthood that she happened to know. And that's what she told me.
And did you do so?
What's that?
Did you do so?
Yes, I did so. And it happened exactly like she said. The result was not favorable as I had wanted it to be, but that the results of it were, I felt, mitigated by following what she told me to do.
What was it like to recite the mantras? What did you feel? Did you feel you were tilting the orbit of something? How did you?
And by the way, can we pull the slide down or move on to the next slide because we're not seeing you speak?
Oh, you're not seeing me speak. Well, let's get back to me. How do I get that?
I can't. So you go up
Or
to the
they?
top of the thing and you put cancel. See, stop
Oh, he's
share.
going to go to
Stop
another
share.
slide.
Stop share? Is there a stop share? Oh, pause share. Okay, I see that. Whoops. Now what?
Okay.
How do I get back to me?
Okay.
Uh,
I think I can do it for you on this side. I can
yeah.
stop participant sharing. There it goes.
All right, there we go. All
Okay.
right. Sorry
If you
about
have
my.
more to share, we'll do it afterwards.
Yeah.
Yeah, if I have something, I might have something to share, but we only have about a half an hour left. So um, I wanted to share something else, but mirror divination, Bianca. Bianca, speak. I want to hear about your mirror divination.
Say what?
I want to hear about your mirror divination.
Well, it
This
was
is something that I'm really interested in, is mirror divination.
Yeah.
yes, I mean, this is taught at RSE as one of the disciplines to just engage seeing yourself on a deeper, higher level. So this particular incident happened prior to that, though. And I would also say this was probably another incident where something in the environment caused some physiological shift in me. But I walked into my bathroom and my mirror was to the left over the sink. And I turned, and the being that I saw was not me. Well, it was me, but it was a different form of me. It was like probably the highest conscious form of me that I could perceive at that moment. The lines of my muscles in my face were different. The auric field of myself was different. And I really just perceived a different part of me in that moment. And it was completely It was shocking, but in the best of possible ways. It was like seeing a part of me that was possible, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. But how did you utilize that?
I am still working on integrating that, because it really taught me about a different potential of myself. And it wasn't, and I might have looked at it at that point. I might have looked for it in that point, and it came to me. It was not a very conscious effort for me to call it. It was more a subconscious work at the time, I would think. But then later, we didn't call it mirror divination. We just called it mirror work, where we sit perhaps with a candle for a very long time, just looking at the mirror and then asking for, just opening up to a connection to the higher self, which I think in many ways, when we talk about connections, they are different levels of us, because in my teachings, we exist on multiple dimensional levels simultaneously, and is to make the cross connection, ultimately to inform us how to probably better live and contribute here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Bianca. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes good sense.
Yeah.
Is it something you've only done, like only that one random occasion, or was it
That one random occasion? I've focused on other types of connecting with, like trance states, for instance. And I actually, just now that you brought it up, I had sort of forgotten about the mirror work in recent years, because just focusing on other ones. So this really makes me want to go back to it. It's a time matter, which one of the many practices can we work into the day? But so it's a great reminder. I appreciate this. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, mirror divination is a really, really important part of what I've learned as shamanic practice.
Yeah.
Ah, interesting.
And I've seen other sorts of shamanistic sessions in which mirrors have been used in collaboration with chanting and music, and like especially late at night,
Yeah.
the fire, where there's something reflective. That's because, I mean, what's divination other than like reflecting something back to you?
Right.
Well, I think there's another dimension to a mirror, and the Van Poos say mirrors widely are seen as portals to another realm.
Right.
But some of the earliest understanding of a portal, or the crack between the veil, through the veil to the other side, would be, for example, the celebration of natural occurring cracks in the rock wall of a cave, right? That was where the spirits could come in and out. So that sense of a passageway through the veil between the realms. I think mirrors also represent that, as well as a reflection.
Yeah, that's a good point about the veils.
Yeah.
Veils between veils are penetrable,
Yes, permeable.
They're veils. They're not rock
Or
walls.
we become permeable and can pass through, or some parts of our senses,
Yeah,
right, can
parts of
expand.
ourselves can pass through, and that's what shamanism is all about. It's like allowing us to.
Passage.
Tony asks here, is there any form of mirror
Interact with that.
more or less effective in divination? Color, temperature, reflective coding. That's the next generation of research. Tony, that's for you.
Yeah.
That's for Tony.
That's for Tony.
Let's bring
I
Tony
think
on.
we
Actually,
should
I
work
think you're
something.
probably right. But Tony, you asked the questions, which means you have
Yeah.
some suspicions about this.
Well, I don't know. I just started wondering, as an optics person, immediately you mentioned mirrors, and I deal with mirrors like that for the web. And so I started wondering if it's convex, if it's concave, if it has a gold coating versus a silver coating versus an aluminum coating, uh, if it's cloudy, or if it's extremely clear. I'm just wondering if any of these things would have a relevance. I suspect not. And then I got wondering also about a mirror. And when we look at ourselves in the mirror, we see the right left parity is actually the opposite of how people see us.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah.
Only if we look at ourselves with a prism do we see ourselves the way others see us. And
Right.
I'm just wondering about some things like that, which might be fun to be really nerdy about it.
Yeah,
That would
absolutely.
be fun. Yeah, that would be a nice little
Well, they do
project. I mean,
too,
people, maybe we could
with optics.
do that in an in-person group sometime.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
Um,
will mention, of course, that we have several postures within the canon
yeah.
of the ecstatic trance postures that do have mirror
On the
and
artifacts.
on the
Oh,
artifacts themselves. And
really?
that's been part of our practices that when we see that element, we say, okay, we're going to do a little bit more of a an advancement with the work.
Add props.
We'll add a prop of a mirror to our practice as part of holding a posture and having a divination experience. And it's been a
Similar
very
to the artifact.
it's been a very powerful, yeah, exactly. I
Is
can
it
actually,
as Lori points out here, is it actually obsidian or is it an actual mirror?
that we're using?
Any reflective
Yeah.
surface.
Oh yeah, any
Yeah,
reflective.
I have an obsidian mirror. I can go grab it if you want to see it.
Oh
And
yeah.
that came from an Aztec temple, sold, not a archaeological artifact. But yes, they were used regularly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll go grab it.
All right, good.
Also, I think that they're finding, especially in Mesoamerica, some of the pigments on some of the aspects of figures where they deteriorated, but originally they were reflective surfaces. But then when it oxidized, the paint became less reflective. But now they're discovering that it was intended to be a reflective surface. I bet the Van Poels would have something to say.
I'm just
on
going
that.
to show one image showing this one artifact that we see a mirror on the chest, and so we have
Oh,
gone ahead and created our own and within our practice to sometimes to do this as a divination posture. But we'll come back to Tony here one second. Hey, Tony.
Alas, I gave it away to a Mayan priestess, so I no longer have it.
Well, whenever the Mayan priestess calls,
Right. We must have comments and
there's
questions.
all kinds of comments.
Let's go.
There's
but wait a minute, but
1,000 of
wait,
them.
before we get to any comments, I would like us to do a little divination. It's like
Set it
Okay.
up.
All right.
half an hour later.
Okay.
Like, I have to go. I would like us to practice some form of divination. What we discussed for some of you who are not in at the very, very, very beginning of this session was a little bit of drum, and Tony, who has more decks of divinatory cards than any human I've ever met, to select one of his 50 decks,
Okay.
or to randomly select one of his 50 decks.
Show my-
And
No.
but we'd have to set a question for ourselves here
Okay.
as a group.
What do you suggest?
Me,
Speaking of ornithomancy, you've got the
Yeah.
ornithomancy. Now
Here,
the
right
bird
there.
just flew onto my shoulder just like minutes ago,
yeah.
and so
When someone says divination's for the birds, it's actually
for the birds, it really
Good
is.
one.
But do we want to ask a general question about like propaganda wants to be a part of this? Well, he is a part of this,
Yeah.
and but
Is Tony going to pull a card then?
does somebody
for us?
want to set a question like
Okay.
anything from the fate of the Ukraine war to whether it's going to snow tomorrow or anything like that, or whether
It's your choice. Yeah.
we're going to be a relaxed country in the future, or anything. Does anybody? I don't want to ask.
Another element to divination, and it's not so much predictive divination, but the divination practice of being able to set oneself in a place and situation is another way of looking at
Yeah,
divination.
that's good. That's good. Why don't you then go for it?
Well,
Paul?
I mean, since we're looking at this particular situation in Ukraine, which is a very serious one that you've brought up, maybe there's a way that as a group and as a community that we set that intention for a positive result. And then in terms of divination, how would that interpret? So that
I'm staying out of this one.
well, no, I mean that's the idea is that if we can do something in a positive way, and the predictive aspect to divination is it's such a powerful part of things. But I also wanted to make sure we include the fact that we all have a certain element of manifestation within ourselves using divination. So we can combine the
Are we
two
trying to
practices.
influence events? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, it can be done. It can be used that way. It can be used in a certain way.
But this is Fred's still.
Okay.
No, but that's fine. In fact, I agree with what Paul is saying, but how we influence events depends upon what card is drawn and how
Yeah.
we interpret that card.
Good
So
point.
so here's what I would
Where's
suggest.
Tony?
Get Tony back on screen.
Oh, Tony, where's Tony? Oh, I think he's grabbing his cards.
No, he's
No,
back.
okay.
He's
Oh,
got
you're
it.
there.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, what I would suggest, our little bit of ritualizing here,
Okay.
is that we, all of us in our Zoom room, maybe just kind of hold ourselves in a relaxed situation while Paul
Yeah.
figures out what he's going to drum for like 1 minute.
Yeah.
Okay.
We can just do a little bit of drumming. Um,
Or do you
I
think
think it's. I think the first step, and we know from our work, ritual is the foundation of any kind of practice such as this. So I want us to take a moment to breathe.
Okay.
Take a moment to recognize the breath itself. We inhale, we pause at the top, and we exhale all the way out. Recognize the power of the breath itself by inhaling, pausing, and exhaling all the way out. Finding that connection to the rhythm of life itself. This is an opportunity for us to switch from the intellectual part of what we've been talking about, and just go back into the direct experience of divination. Divination is at that core, and breath will lead us there. And everyone can keep their eyes closed. And I'm just going to do a little bit of soft drumming while we each take a moment just to connect with that innermost part of ourselves.
Here, get out of here, Ray.
So we all have set our intention and opened ourselves to the deepest part of ourselves, opening the window and doorway to where all of knowledge exists, the flow of that intuition and guidance and knowledge that connects us to all that universal language of spirit, of the soul itself. We're going to use Tony as a representative of all of us here. And also Tony's dogs. And Tony can have a deck that speaks to him, and he's gonna pull a card for us as a community.
Thank you. I muted when the doggies barked. I feel inspired to pull a card from each of two decks. So here is the first card, and let's see if I can.
What is it?
Faith in the process. Okay.
Okay, and here is the second.
Resistance.
Resistance.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So,
And faith in the process. Do you want to flip the one card around?
And-
Read it
and-
back?
Yes, sorry about that.
Oh, interesting.
no, intuitively, when the card's upside down, it has another meaning. So it's kind of,
We must have faith in the process.
faith in the process.
So faith in the process, a woman leaning down with a bird on her back,
Mm-hmm.
and this resistance is pushing away against a whirlwind of some kind. So what can we make of this?
Well, Bianca says this is like two sides of the same coin,
Huh.
because you
To
have.
me, it certainly is. I mean,
Go ahead and speak.
I would say that I asked the question to understand my responsibility in the current world conflict. Now, this sounds a little odd, but in the Ho'oponopono tradition, we assume responsibility as having a part of responsibility of all. And the lack of the faith in process and the resistance because out of fear are the two parts to me that speak to me very poignantly to my personal question.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. I really see what you're saying about them being two sides of a coin,
Yeah.
faith and resistance. Wow,
That's
that's
a virtue.
really very powerful
Yeah.
image that those two cards should be drawn on a very difficult question.
Yeah. And others who have input, go ahead and raise your Zoom hand so I can see you, and then you can go ahead and turn on your mic. Yeah.
Comments from the gallery here.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you want to read some, Fred?
Or use the chat room. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. What was the second card? It's resistance. The first card is faith in the process.
Tony, what does it say to you?
I think it says that there is a form of meaning in that we can resist things that are ignorant, things that are imposing on us, but which may not be necessary.
This is really, yeah, go on.
No, that's it.
Yeah.
No, I think that this is a perfect example of divination, because what we're seeing are the whole expanse of it's absolutely answering our question from the situation in which we placed ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
It's really reflecting back to us, our situation.
Yeah.
How we're resisting so much. That bird represents a still small voice within to me. And it's interesting that we've been talking about birds, and then you pull a card, Tony, of a woman seeking guidance, right? And then the bird is right there, in effect whispering in her ear.
And as part of our ongoing posture research, the bird, we find it so many, especially Mesoamerican, where the bird is a part of the sculpture. It's
Old
there.
Europe
It's there
as
for a
well.
reason, and Old Europe as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. The other thing that's interesting about Tony pulling these two cards from two different decks. This is not the same deck so
Two different decks.
Yeah, two different decks. So all of a sudden we get this element of what looks to be spontaneous, unrelated elements happening, and all of a sudden
put two together and they tell a story with the connection between the two.
Well said. Yeah.
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 I read it as
Oh,
persistence.
here's the two decks.
Okay.
One is called Sacred Rebel Oracle, and the other one is called Storm Journey Story Cards. Yeah, so very interesting.
Now, I wanted to ask Tony,
Yeah, go
because
ahead.
he knows more about this than maybe almost anybody on planet Earth,
Okay.
about how the nature of divination and the nature of synchronicity fit together in your view.
Good question.
Well, I think we like to. You started out talking about science, and you have the wonderful T-shirt, and of course, I advocate for science too. But then I think of where discovery comes from, and yes, there was the Edisonian experiment, which to develop the light bulb, where there were something like 10,000 trials until it happened. But that's not really the way most science occurs. It happens sometimes that way, but usually that there's a core idea. And for example, as an undergraduate, I was working at a radio astronomy facility operated by Harvard and MIT, and there was a big problem. It wasn't working right, and I was hired for a semester and a summer to work there, and there was all sorts of brain power trying to figure out what the problem was. And here I am after my sophomore year. I woke up one morning and I knew the answer. I went in and told them, but people have been puzzling about that for over a year about what the problem was. I knew the answer, and it just like came to me from a dream, and I began to see that there's a different pattern of how things happen, and maybe my path of experiences, which would be different than those of those at Harvard or at MIT. Maybe this was designed this way, and I keep on thinking that there is an underlying pattern, and I see this in so many ways. Uh, for example, when I'm out sleeping under the stars in the desert, uh, I go by intuition about where to place my sleeping bag. I don't look for the loveliest spot or the softest sand or things like that. I look for, I just know where to go and where not to go, and it seems to be right. And Bianca can talk about many experiences she's had. I've had some similar ones where I've been asked if I can tell what a place is, and I walk right to it. And I don't quite. It's a little different than the cognitive process, but there is something going on. But you mentioned synchronicity, and yes, there is. I have. I don't want to bore this audience again because I've mentioned some examples, but I've had uncanny, totally impossible situations of connection happening between over time and over space. Things that connect Philadelphia to where I live now, or connect Northern California to where I live now, in the most improbable way.
How does it affect your worldview or your understanding or about the universe and our place in it? How do you integrate that into your thinking?
Yeah, having those uncanny experiences.
How do you
Okay.
bridge?
Well, if I had all the answers, I would probably write the book, but I don't have the answers yet, Laura.
But I meant for you personally.
It's more a visceral thing. I feel, I respect it, and I have a few experiments. I'm gathering some data from my own point of view, which do not necessarily match some other people who are looking at this problem. But I think there is um, much more to it than is generally accepted. And I think we're getting to a point where the scientific method can be applied, and we can ask questions that would have been impossible to ask a few decades ago, even 10 years ago. So this is interesting. I mean, we look even at the maybe because I'm in the field of astronomy, and we're talking about things that are so incredibly intangible,
Right.
farther away than we have any way to grasp. But
Right.
yet we can discern things about this. We've developed a distant scale of the universe. How marvelous! We've
Right.
discovered what is the beginning of time in our universe as we know it. These are all very subtle things. When you consider 100 years ago, we did not know anything existed beyond the Milky Way, really, and other galaxies were called great nebulae, or gaseous clouds, and this all unfolded in a marvelous story over the last century,
Wow.
and the rate of it unfolding is faster and faster and faster now. So it's pretty exciting, and look out for what's happening with Webb, and then really look out for what's happening with the next great observatory.
Well, and you
Thank you,
have this,
Tony.
and you have that. It's interesting. The two of you became roommates at one time in your lives as youngsters, and you got this two worlds where really the world of divination and the world of looking to the stars is one thing. I mean, it's not a separate world. It's the idea that the ancient cultures
Look to the stars to
that was their
define
guide.
world
That was the
events,
guidance
one
that
of
they went
many.
by. So
Yeah.
yeah, so the two of you could write a book together.
So,
Well, Bernie
Yeah,
Maitland
maybe.
talked about
Yeah.
keeping a synchronicity diary,
Yeah,
but also all the hunches and intuitions. I mean, we can all, you talked about doing your own experiments, but we can all collect data and start a dream journal that's a synchronicity journal, that's a
Right,
interesting
we should.
coincidence,
Yeah.
that's an intuition journal. Wouldn't it be fascinating if we just all wrote that down and then tested
well,
our hunches, tested
let
them?
me make a suggestion.
Sure.
Uh,
Yeah.
if we want to do this scientifically,
Okay.
let's not use Jung's language.
Okay.
Uh,
Let's what?
for,
Let's
for
use
the,
Jung's language.
Don't use it.
Don't use.
let's not use it because that presupposes a result, and that makes it more
Gotcha.
difficult
Okay.
to
I
do
understand.
More
Yes.
neutral
Yeah,
language.
yeah.
Okay.
So I'm kind of careful about this. I differ from Bernie and others on that, but I'm kind of careful about that.
Sure.
An experiment I did. a little over a decade ago, and I did kind of like what Laura is describing, and this is not it, but I kept a pocket-sized notebook with me at all times.
Yeah.
And whenever I got an idea, an impression about something, I would write it on this side of the page. And then
Ah,
when I found out what happened, I would write it on the other side.
Oh,
And, and very often there was a cause and effect, but there was one amazing result. And maybe I'll just suggest that the more I did it, the more impressions came to me. It's
Mm.
yeah.
kind of like if we're listening, we're told more. And I would be very interested if anybody from this audience was to do this. And if you did have the same experience I did, that the more you notice, uh, the more they come to you, and maybe the more correct they are.
Right.
That is part of trusting the process.
Hmm.
That is trusting the process, that we are actually vehicles and instruments
Allowing it. Yeah.
and this inner technology that can pick all this up, right? That is trusting the process, just like your card said. So that's wonderful. Why don't we all do that? I'm going to start that. I carry notebooks with me everywhere.
That's true. Yeah. You
Anyone
do.
knows me probably
Yeah.
noticed, but I'll
I think
dedicate
they're
one
three for
just
a dollar at the dollar store or something like that. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Exactly.
but I would suggest keeping it not in a big journal and not overwriting it. Just just a sentence or two when you have an impression. I like I should call somebody, or and then you call and you find out that you really should have, or maybe you find out you should that it's irrelevant, but at least you've gone through the effort whenever you have these little impulse things. So it's not the sort of thing you want to wait to the end of the day and you gather all your thoughts and you have a half hour to write. Take 30 seconds to write something down when you feel it.
Right.
Right, in just a few
that's a really good
don't tell
idea.
the whole story, let the story unfold, but just note
Right.
it
Right.
in its
Yeah.
pure, yeah, simplicity.
The other thing is it's so easy to forget or
Mhm,
to deny that
Mhm.
this. Memory is so imperfect. I
mhm.
know my own mother had several very significant experiences,
Mhm.
and 2 years later she said, "Oh, I never had that experience, Tony. How could you say that?" It
Yeah.
was because it was too peculiar for her to integrate.
Yeah.
And we have to realize if we want to do something and integrate it, even if we're not in the situation my mother was in, being very traditional, even so, it's good to have this record. Yes, I've done this, and 75 out of 92 times it turned out to be significant, and the rate has tripled over the month I'm doing this. That kind of thing.
Right.
And also, I think we're going to
Absolutely.
be surprised if we do record these, how many we have in the course of a day, how natural this process is,
Hmm.
right? How
Yeah.
much
So,
of it
so I simply called it prompting. So I tried to keep it really
prompting.
away from other language and maybe
That's a
even
neutral word. It's a good word. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. Good
And,
points,
and
Tony. Thank
another
you.
and another extension of that is the artistic aspect of it. And we've been experimenting the last 2 months with our Wednesday advanced group of doing what we call art and spirit, where we do the posture work. Take that moment to tap into that unified field and draw that knowledge out and see what's there. And then everybody say, whether you get crayons or pencils or whether you write poems or whatever you do, make an artistic expression of your experience, in addition to just a
And how
traditional
visual it
journaling.
is.
And all of a sudden, all this little small images become so significant and important to people as
And
part
we
of their
can
journey.
cross connect
Yeah,
them. Yeah,
yeah,
really
That's really
interesting.
good.
yeah,
Gosh, now that have some free time, maybe I should be in that Wednesday group.
yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We'd
You're
love
so
to have you.
welcome.
You'd be
You are
welcome.
all
Yeah,
welcome.
Oh,
you're all
that sounds
welcome.
great.
Maybe I can mention that I just got back from a 3 week lecture tour, and
Yeah.
when I'm sitting by myself in restaurants, I carry a little set of watercolors, and sometimes I'll just start putting color down on a piece of paper, and then I start writing, and the words come to me, and there's some kind of connection that happens.
That's
Uh,
divination.
uh, yeah. So anyway, I thought I would mention that too. And sometimes it feels like I'm being spoken to. So
Yeah,
that's
yeah. Yeah.
I think when we look back at our life, there's a sense that something larger co-wrote it with us. Opened doors, closed doors, prompted us down certain paths, beckoned us at certain moments, saved us at certain moments.
You know,
Yeah.
and I'm reminded,
I
Tony,
agree
because
with
you
that.
told the story of your mother. You know, as you know, as part of our ongoing conversation for exploration series, I'm editing interviews that we've done in the past. So I just pulled up an interview that we had done in let me see, what was it,
It
2001
was
or something.
the year after your mother died.
Yeah, that was the same year.
Same
And so I'm
year.
telling the story of these visitations I'm having by my mother in this interview, and I'm playing this cassette back. It's like, oh yeah, because I didn't journal it at the time. It was just such a spontaneous experience. And so I go into great detail about this connection that I'm having with this afterlife experience. And so it was so meaningful that I had that recorded because I never journaled it. And it was like you say, it kind of slips away and you kind of forgot that you had that experience and what that power meant to you.
I grabbed him and put him in front of the mic and
Yeah,
said,
Laura.
"You must share this story."
Come with me, young man. We're putting you on the mic.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I would also say just the small, minute things. In aggregate, I think they're very important.
Yeah.
Almost like, almost like I was told not to put my sleeping bag down in this beautiful spot, but I did it on a harsher environment with stones on a 15-degree slope, and I was safe, but there were scorpion tracks where I was going to sleep. That kind
Oh,
of.
yeah. Yeah.
All
All
right.
right. Thank you, Tony. And anyone else want to jump in on this? Hey, Fred, you want to jump in?
No, I just think that it's getting towards
Don't you
the.
have more? You
Okay.
put this whole thing together, and we haven't even gotten.
I
scratched the
covered like
surface.
10% of what I wrote down,
I
and
know.
10%. So can
which is
we
fine. It's
have part
fine.
two?
What we did was great.
I think
I
it
don't
was
regret
wonderful.
not including anything that I put in. I had a bunch of stuff on Halloween, but hey, it was too scary.
Oh, really?
We'll deal with that some
Oh,
other Halloween season.
But
And
to be continued. Yeah.
and of course, anytime you want to post something on our website as a paper to be shared, we'd love to have that. We would post it for you. In
I just
addition,
want to read it and have
I
it.
know.
wanna
We
hear
want
this.
them on
see, I
the
mean,
air.
if we were to like talk about all the different forms of divination that everybody in this Zoom room, 27 of us right now, happen to know, it would take all day just to run through all of it because nature is so connected.
So deep.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And for us to limit divination to a couple of things like oracular possession or bobbing for apples
Yeah.
or where to put the sleeping bag or turning to know the direction of the chi or the prana, something like that. I mean, there could be hundreds of different forms of divination.
Each one's are deep.
No doubt there have been, and that there are.
Yeah.
You know.
And I thought
Uh,
Woody had the best fun answer. He said the
what
Farmer's
did he say?
Almanac as a divination
Wonderful.
practice. Yeah.
Oh, that's true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And God knows what Todd and Christine can tell us about Mesoamerica.
Oh, that's
Man,
another, yeah,
that would be
hours of discussion.
amazing what they
Absolutely.
could, what just what their work tells them about how they did all of this. I mean, we can learn from the Popol Vuh and all sorts of
Yeah.
what we've been able to resurrect from Mesoamerican culture.
Yeah.
A lot of divination there.
Yeah.
And
Todd and Christine, you just turn them on and step back because they've got.
right.
Todd, you have to say something. We're invoking your name.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we'll add it to the discussion.
This has all been very interesting, and thank you, Fred, for a very interesting discussion. One of the things that keeps on coming back to my mind as you're talking about this are the various sources of the divination messages. And so you've mentioned everything from deities to some sort of a natural impact in terms of animals or whatnot. And I'm interested if in the cultures that you're looking at, if there is like a hierarchy in terms of the divination, such that certain divinatory messages are considered more accurate or more reliable than others. So, for example, is the spirit possession that you mentioned by the deity considered a higher level or more reliable than, say, seeing a bird out on a branch that's kind of lower to the ground?
Those are questions that maybe we can research.
You bet. You bet.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Very cool. Thank you.
Exciting.
You
Exciting.
have a lot. Todd and Christine, you have a lot then that you could also say from your own research into the cultures that you study.
At least another 2 hours, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, Fred is exactly correct that it seems to be, divination seems to be a worldwide cross-cultural phenomenon. I don't know of a single culture that does not have some means of divination.
Right.
Yeah, I agree.
He's exactly right with that.
So we can pick this topic up again and further dive into it.
And we've touched on the mirror conversation with Christine before as well, too. So, yeah.
So.
Yeah. All right. Thank you both for joining us again.
And we look forward to you next month.
Yes, they're coming. So don't miss out on the Todd and Christine show. Yeah. All right. And Tony, you always add.
I just want to have one final statement. I'm
of course you
so
do.
pleased to be associated with such cool people as all of you.
Yeah. Well, you know, our
this is the table that I want to have a seat at. Right? All of you.
Our advisory committee is so fun when you just, Todd and Christine and Tony and of course Fred and it just goes on, Brian and this just the discussions. Also, what's
and Carolyn, yep.
Theater.
Bianca, we have to,
Theater.
Thomas Riccio.
Thomas Riccio. I'm just drawing a blank, but
Barbara Cox.
Barbara. Anyway, so much fun and so exciting for all of you to want to contribute and participate and continue the conversation. So this is what makes this thing tick for us. Thank you for spending your lifetime and researching deep into these areas.
Thanks for all the adventures that you've had, Fred, and thank you for not dismissing something.
Yeah.
Thank you for checking it out and seeing what's there and not having a foregone conclusion. Because truly that's what science is supposed to be. Investigate before you make assumptions. Tony was just alluding to that. Mm-hmm. So it's any and everything that you've looked into. You have shared fresh insight with us. You've had adventures that most of us will never have.
You were researching Ayurveda before that word even came to the West. None of us knew what the heck that was. It was not ever, and now it's become like every bookshelf. There's something to do with Ayurveda, and there's all kinds of medicines and herbs and applications and things being interpreted. But it's nice that you went to the source. You did your homework. You did it right, and so we're appreciative that we have access to that through you.
Well, thank you all for all the stuff you've given me access to.
Thank you.
A little bit more energy.
Thank you.
Thank you, Fred. Very cool, Madison.
Yay.